Welcome to episode 48 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. This month I was happy to have back a frequent guest, Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston. He is also a prolific author. His latest book is The Bittersweet Science, Racism, Racketeering, and the Political Economy of Boxing. His other latest book is The Dawning of the Apocalypse and White Supremacy Confronted. In this episode, we talked about the legend Paul Robeson. Dr. Horne spoke on his book, Paul Robeson, The Artist is Revolutionary, and dug into Robeson's obsession with languages, his activism, the Civil Rights Congress, and We Charge Genocide, and how Robeson identified as an anti-fascist. Thank you to Awareness for the music, and here's a brief jingle by a fellow Channel Zero Network member.
KiteLine is a weekly 30-minute radio program focusing on issues in the prison system. You'll hear news along with stories from prisoners and former prisoners as well as their loved ones. You'll learn what prison is, how it functions, and how it impacts all of us.
Behind the prison walls, a message is called a kite. Whispered words, a note passed hand to hand, a request submitted to the guards for medical care. Illicit or not, sending a kite means trusting that other people will bear it farther along until it reaches its destination. Here on KiteLine, we hope to share these words across the prison walls.
You can hear us on the Channel Zero network and find out more at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.
My first question was, when did you first hear Paul Robeson and become enthralled? And also, you had a relationship with Paul Robeson Jr., is that correct?
Yeah. I'm not really sure when I first heard of Paul Robeson. Certainly by the age of 17, when I left St. Louis for Princeton University, because, of course, Paul Robeson spent a good deal of his childhood in Princeton University, and that was made known to me almost from the day I arrived. I might have heard of him even before then, because I still have in my mind's eye my mother telling me about the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in 1953. So I was told at a very young age. And of course, Paul Robeson was one of the campaigners for Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, the purported so-called atomic spies who allegedly leaked the, quote, secret, unquote, building atomic weapons to Moscow, although you can go online now and find a design for atomic weapons. As a matter of fact, I recall in the 1970s, the Progressive magazine of Madison, Wisconsin, they published a series of articles about how to design an atomic weapon. You can probably still find that article. So with regard to Paul Robeson Jr., I, of course, knew him in New York. I knew his daughter, Susan Robeson, as well, who would be Paul Sr.'s granddaughter. Paul Jr., if that's the correct designation, and I oftentimes appeared on WBAI FM 99.5 on your FM dial in New York City, the Pacifica radio station, in various programs. And, of course, I was acquainted with him and, of course, really enjoyed his 2-volume biography of his father.
Yes, and didn't he write a longer rebute to one of his father's memoirs, like as a refute of all the errors in it?
Well, what it is that Martin Duberman was tasked by Paul Jr. to write the so-called official biography of Paul Jr.'s father. And it's a very long book, but Paul Jr. was dissatisfied with the book. And so I recall when I was working on my Robeson biography at NYU, New York University. I can't recall in which collection, but there is a lengthy point-by-point refutation of the Duberman biography by Paul Jr. And as I recall, it's even longer than the Duberman biography. I think the Duberman biography was about 700-800 pages. This is probably longer. So to put it mildly, Paul Jr. was displeased with this biography. But unlike many people who are displeased, he went and wrote his own biography, which, as I said, is very useful, very interesting. It's 2 volumes.
Yeah, that's awesome to have that documented. My next question was, could you lay a foundation of the importance of language for Paul Robeson and his dedication and obsession with his studies? I believe you had written his father taught him Hebrew,
And he was a Greek scholar, and Robeson would study language for up to 12 hours a day sometimes.
Yeah, Robeson was obsessed and fascinated with languages. He said that if he had not taken the career path that he did take, he would have been quite satisfied to be a professor of philology, which is, that is to say, a professor who studies the structure and comparative nature of languages. He also felt that it had a political purpose insofar as he thought that it resonated with people if you could speak to them in their own tongue. I think in the book, I talk about before he goes to do a concert in Norway, he takes up the study of Norwegian so that he could speak to the Norwegians in their own language. And he, of course, was very fluent in Russian, which held him in good stead during his visits to the former Soviet Union. And Paul Jr. also was fluent in Russian. Indeed, one of the ways in which Paul Jr. earned a living was by translating Russian scientific documents and other documents into English. Both Paul the Elder and Paul the Junior had a fascination with the Russian language in particular, which in some ways stems from their mutual fascination with Pushkin, who oftentimes is given credit for being the father of the modern Russian language and is still a writer. He is continuously read, not only in Russia, but in translation all over the world. He's a 19th century writer and, of course, was of African descent. But Paul Sr. was fluent in most of the major European languages. He studied African languages. He studied Chinese and, of course, sang in Chinese. I think you can still find online Robeson's senior rendition of the Chinese national anthem, which I believe is entitled The March of the Volunteers. So language was very important to Paul Robeson Sr.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and you had, in the footnote in the book, you had typed out that Robeson knew 25 languages and could sing in 24. And one thing I really found interesting was, not only his internationalism, but how he spoke of the solidarity and internationalism of music. When he said you had written that Paul felt a connection with the Welsh and Irish as well. He said that Gaelic folk songs are close to our own. And one of his favorite movies was the Proud Valley film in Wales that he did. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about this notion of internationalism in music, as you mentioned, with knowing the language is just one amazing thing which made him so popular. But he had talked about these similarities between Hebridean songs, Chinese, African, and Hungarian folk songs were part of the pentatonic model.
Well, yes, I think you've summed it nicely. I mean, I think that Robeson Sr. was trying to not only build bridges between and amongst different ethnic groups and different peoples, but also was trying to suggest a commonality between and amongst different ethnic groups and different peoples. Oftentimes in concerts, he would start off, say, singing a so-called Negro spiritual and then flow from his voice ineluctably into a song from another group, for example, and then that would flow ineluctably into a song from another group. And he was trying to show that there was an underlying commonality between and amongst all of these different renditions, trying to show that humanity is one, which in a sense was undergirding his political project, particularly the political project insofar as it dovetailed with socialism, because the idea then, and I dare say even now, is that all peoples are marching inevitably to a similar beat towards an end goal of socialism. Now, the way things stand now, many of us in North America will be late to the finish line, so to speak. But in any case, it reminds me of the line from Martin Luther King Jr., the speech that he gives right before he's assassinated in Memphis in April 1968, where he says, "I may not get there with you, but I know we'll all get to the promised land." Well, one way to translate that is in Robeson-like verbiage, in the sense that Robeson expired circa 1976, as I recall, and he obviously will not get there with us, but I would dare say that he would agree that we'll all reach that end point of socialism sooner rather than later, or as used to be said, socialism or barbarism.
The Mountaintop speech is so powerful by Dr. King. I was wondering if you could speak about the notion that he found other places like Africa and London and Soviet Union and Africa. And this book seemed to have a focus on London as well, which was a really interesting perspective. And really just the importance of England and some more things that you open up in this book on Robeson.
Well, Robeson spent about 2 decades in self-imposed exile in London, and from London he traveled, particularly throughout Europe. And I recall when I first started going to London to do research, and one of the things that struck me was how, on a mass level and an elite level, in London there was obvious discrimination against those of Nigerian origin, Jamaican origin, West African origin, East African origin, Caribbean origin, etc. But as a person from the United States, one of the things that struck me was the nature of accent discrimination in the UK. And of course, you have accent discrimination in the United States of America. It always strikes me how even in the South, newscasters generally don't speak with a Southern accent because it's seen as somehow regressive or retrograde, etc. And that is a prelude to suggest that Robeson felt comfortable in London, although he was well aware of what I just made reference to, which is the rampant discrimination not only against those of Jamaican, Caribbean, African descent, but also against the Black British population whose roots stretch back hundreds of years in England. I mean, I've only personally traced it back to the 1500s, but there are others who have traced it back further than that. And I think that, generally speaking, my own perceptions of how I was treated in London compared to how I'm treated in the United States led me to write a book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, that tries to revise the traditional understanding of the revolt against British rule that led to the formation of the United States, insofar as many historians had noted previously, by several orders of magnitude, Africans had not stood with the rebels. And interestingly enough, that's where Robeson and I diverge, because Robeson was quite proud, and mentioned it frequently. He was quite proud of the fact that his ancestors actually were some of the minority who did stand with the so-called patriots in 1776. Now, of course, he was saying that in order to refute the idea, which is quite rampant in this country, and perhaps for good reason, that Black Americans oftentimes side with the antagonists of the United States of America, such as during the War of 1812, when they helped the British sack Washington, D.C. in August 1814, then fled on boats to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continued to reside, or even Robeson was trying to refute the idea that his being pro-Moscow was somehow inconsistent with being a U.S. patriot. But this shows how matters evolve, because I consider myself to be a lineal descendant of Paul Robeson, but that does not necessarily mean that I accept every jot and tittle of what he espoused, particularly with regard to the origins of the United States, because I think one of the things about history is that history has a certain fluidity. That is to say that certain facts are immutable, such as the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. But what changes is our interpretation of why it happened at that particular moment. And those interpretations change based upon new insight, based upon new documents, based upon new revelations, based upon our perception of contemporary reality. So I would say that I agree with Robeson with regard to his feeling more comfortable in London than he did in New York, for example, because I certainly feel more comfortable in London and have felt more comfortable than in New York. But like Robeson, as a Black American, you feel more comfortable just about anywhere on planet Earth than in the place where you're born. And of course, I would say that this stems from the fact that the enslaved population in the 18th century engaged in class struggle against the slave masters. They did not engage in class collaboration. That is to say, siding with their oppressors, were rebelling against British rule for their own reasons. And for their own reasons, their own class interests, the enslaved population chose not to join, for the most part, of that rebellion. And it's very interesting that even people on the left who consider themselves to be driven by class analysis, when it comes to analyzing Black people in the 18th century, they drop class analysis and start talking about race, which is fine. You know, I'm down with talking about race, but these same people, they oftentimes just miss race analysis as identity politics, except when it comes to the 18th century when they wallow in what they otherwise condemn as identity politics. But excuse this lengthy digression, but I've been involved in these debates of various sorts on these matters. And so this issue has occupied a good deal of my mental space, I'm afraid.
No, thank you for breaking that open and really going back to where you and Robeson diverge. Do you think this has to do with the strong, hagiography or mythology of the U.S. beginnings and how, like Du Bois would say, this propaganda of history has had more holes poked through it since Robeson's day and through scholarship and scholars like you as well?
Oh, sure. I mean, as I said, you mentioned Du Bois. I'm reviewing the latest edition of Black Reconstruction, where he talks about the propaganda of history. One of the things that strikes me about Black Reconstruction, many things strike me, but to the point on the table right now, one of the things that strikes me is the pessimism that Du Bois has about the United States of America. Now, of course, he's writing in the 1930s. I understand why there might be a certain amount of pessimism, given the lynchings and the almost casual oppression. But nowadays, for example, despite, on the one hand, a lot of serious discussion about the rise of fascism in the United States and a possible coup d'etat that could take place within a few years with the next presidential election, more revelations are emerging about the attempted coup on January 6, 2021. And yet, we have, running parallel to that, a number of scholars who are much more, how should I put this? They tend to, unlike Du Bois, they tend to view the past through rose-colored glasses. They see the organizing of the Republican Party in the 1850s as leading almost inevitably to the abolition of slavery. Du Bois would beg to differ. There are even scholars who see the formulation of the U.S. Constitution in the late 18th century, despite the idea of 3/5 of a human being affixed to the enslaved population of African descent. This document is seen as an anti-slavery document, despite the fugitive slave clauses, etc. So I think that fortunately history evolves. I mean, for example, I read the book decades ago. Now I'm reading it again. I've only been up to page 300. But as I recall, one of the areas where Du Bois lags is in integrating indigenous history into his overall narrative. But that fault of Du Bois, which I think will be threaded throughout the text, as I said, I read it decades ago, and I'm just reading it again and haven't finished. I mean, that happens today, in 2022, despite decades of scholarship in indigenous history, despite the fact that we now know that Hitler, for example, per quotations that you'll find in the writings of scholars like Claudio Sant, S-A-U-N-T, of the University of Georgia, who's written about the Trail of Tears and the Cherokee expulsion, and others, that Hitler felt that he could credibly replicate in the 1930s what the U.S. settlers and the U.S. leaders replicated in the 1830s. Because as he saw things, there was hardly a flutter globally with regard to the genocide against the indigenous population, the expropriation. So why would there be a flutter in the 1930s when he tacked east from Berlin? So that is an illustration, it seems to me, of how history does not stand still. History, as some would have it, is arguments without end. And our interpretations of the past oftentimes change depending upon the temper of the moment. Because oftentimes people feel they need a history that sheds light on the present. And if the history is not shedding light on the present, well, I think you'll see the history is discarded. I think that's one of the reasons right now where so many students are not studying history, because they don't find it relevant. They don't feel that it's shedding light on the present. It's antiquarian, as we used to call it. And so, once again, I don't think my divergence from either Robeson or Du Bois on certain matters of history should be seen as detracting from their historic importance or even necessarily critical of how they view things. It's more of a commentary upon where we are today in 2022 and the revelations that have emerged since Du Bois' death in 1963, Robeson's death in 1976. It would be as if, DNA is uncovered. That's the correct verb, circa 1953. And so Charles Darwin did not uncover DNA, although you can say that he laid the foundation for sane. But in any case, it's not an insult to Charles Darwin when people today speak of DNA. They're standing on his shoulders. New insights have emerged. New revelations have emerged. And only those who are inflexible intellectually and politically would seek to argue otherwise.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely the different branches have the same roots, or even like rhizomes and other things are all connected and feed from those foundations. Let's see, I'd like to talk about Robeson as anti-colonist and anti-fascist. And you had a really good quote from Robeson in the book on internationalism. You said, speaking of Japan invading China and Italy invading Abyssinia, Robeson said, quote, "The time seems long past when people can afford to think exclusively in terms of national units." And I thought it was just such a great quote from Robeson. And if you could talk about the significance of the Civil Rights Congress and the Council on African Affairs and just how monumental these creations were.
Well, first of all, the Council on African Affairs, it comes to existence circa 1937 under the aegis of Robeson, even though he's in London. It's a U.S.-based organization. It comes as a direct result of his interaction with Africans in London, such as Jomo Kenyatta, the founding father of modern Kenya, with whom he was close. And, of course, he also interacted with C.L.R. James of Trinidad and Tobago and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, etc. Now, the Council of African Affairs was designed to seek to undermine colonialism. Note that as of the time of the Council on African Affairs founding, you had fundamentally only two, quote, independent, unquote, African nations. One, Liberia, which was in many ways a neo-colony of the United States, founded in the 19th century as a result of expulsions of free Negroes and enticements of free Negroes in the United States to leave the United States. And then there's Ethiopia on the other side of the continent in East Africa, which was at that point in the 1930s under siege by Mussolini's fascist Italy in an attempt to eliminate its sovereignty. Just a footnote here. In current research that I'm doing on Northeast Africa, one of the points that I find intriguing is that in the 1890s, Italy, pre-fascist Italy, once again was trying to subdue Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. And one of the reasons it was not able to accomplish that goal was because the Ethiopians, or the Abyssinians, as they were then called, were armed to the teeth by Russia, interestingly enough, for various reasons. And that's caused me to think a bit more deeply about pre-1917, pre-Bolshevik Revolution Russia and its role in the world and how that might help us to understand Russia today in the 21st century. In any case, the Council on African Affairs had as its chief executive officer for a good deal of its history the former Howard University professor Alpheus Hunton, who, like so many, was jailed because of refusal to name names. This is in the early 1950s, by the way. Interestingly enough, jailed alongside him was the mystery writer Dashiell Hammett, Dashiell. Some of your comrades may know from his work, such as The Thin Man, which was turned into a movie series, The Maltese Falcon, one of the more popular writers of that time, who, of course, was very close to the U.S. left, as was his partner, Lillian Hellman, who was a playwright and writer. You may be familiar with her play Watch on the Rhine, which was turned into a movie, and other works of note. In any event, the Council on African Affairs, founded by Robeson as an expression of his interest in Africa, was also assisted mightily by his spouse, Islanda Robeson, who was not only his spouse, but his business manager. And she was really the person who sort of lit a fire under Robeson, who might have been content to just study languages and perhaps become a professor of philology, as he thought he might become, but for her pushing him into various arenas. I mean, he basically becomes a singer and an actor as a result of her influence. And she, too, was an anti-colonial crusader, visiting South Africa with their son, Paul Jr., in the late 1930s, traveling throughout the continent as well. Her books on that journey are still available, certainly in libraries. I'm not sure if they're still in print. But alas, what happens in 1956 is that as a result of the Red Scare and McCarthyism, anti-communism, in short, the Council on African Affairs has run out of business. The same holds true for the Civil Rights Congress, which comes into existence in circa 1946 as a result of a merger of different organizations, including the National Negro Congress, which had come into existence in the 1930s, the International Labor Defense, which had come into existence in the 1930s, spearheading the fight to save the lives of the Scottsboro Nine, the 9 black youth in Alabama, accused falsely of sexual molestation of 2 Euro-American women, headed to execution before the International Labor Defense, which, as his name suggested, was global in scope, launched a global campaign against U.S. Jim Crow, not unlike the global campaign against apartheid South Africa, involving demonstrations at U.S. legations globally, U.S. corporations globally, leading to their lives being saved, leading to a change in the law as promulgated by the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1930s. It was really the prelude and the precursor to the anti-Jim Crow push of the 1950s. And then the third group that merges to form the Civil Rights Congress in 1946 is the National Federation of Constitutional Liberty, something like that. You need to look at my book to clarify it. These organizations came together and they formed the Civil Rights Congress. I'm looking at the book right now. Yes, the National Federation of Constitutional Liberties. I got it correctly. They focused on cases like the Scottsboro case, that is to say, cases of racist repression. Case of Willie McGee, for example, a black man in Mississippi who's accused of raping a Euro-American woman, a woman with whom he was having an affair, but when the affair was uncovered, she accused him of rape, and he was executed. Actually executed outside, as rather ghoulishly, many Euro-Americans gathered to cheer. It was like a state-sanctioned lynching, and instead of a rope, they had an electric chair. They were able to set up outside. And, of course, other cases, I won't go into the details, the Trenton Six, for example, the Martinsville Seven out of Virginia, the case of all the Communist Party defendants who were perpetually on trial. The Civil Rights Congress was led by one of Robeson's closest comrades, speaking of the black lawyer from San Francisco, William L. Patterson, who also was jailed during that time. For our purposes here, one of the most important contributions of the Civil Rights Congress and Robeson was their filing a petition at the United Nations charging the United States with genocide against black people. A very important intervention. It put the U.S. ruling class in the dock. It put enormous pressure on the United States to get its house in order. It was a gigantic step forward. And, of course, Robeson paid a very heavy price as a result, because up until that time, up until the advent of the Red Scare, the post-1945 Red Scare, he may have been the best-known so-called U.S. Negro in the world. But after the Red Scare attained liftoff, his income plummeted from the high six figures to the low four figures. It was difficult for him to find a hall that would be rented to him to have a concert. His passport was taken, so he could not leave the United States to pursue a living. He was hauled before congressional committees and grilled. Fortunately, unlike Patterson, he was not jailed, although he came mightily close, as did W.E.B. Du Bois, too, by the way, who was put on trial during the same time for being a purported agent of Moscow, because Du Bois was campaigning against nuclear weapons. If you were against nuclear weapons, that meant that you were pro-communist, apparently. So, in sum, those are the stories of the Council on African Affairs and the Civil Rights Congress.
Thanks for breaking those open. And just to give that was 1951 when he presented the petition to the UN accusing U.S. of genocide against African Americans.
Yes, that was 1951. And it caused quite a stir.
And even the lead up into what he was saying was just so revolutionary. When he visited Dachau in 1945, he said genocide stalks the USA. Then he was speaking at the Joint Anti-Fascist Refugee Committee, as you had written, and spoke about the hypocriticalness of the Nuremberg trials and so forth.
Oh, yes. I mean, that was part of the internationalism of Robeson. And, of course, I guess some who are listening to me now may wonder, why did he leave London, where he left in the late 1930s to return to the United States, given what I've said thus far? And a lot of it has to do with the eruption of World War II in Europe, August, September 1939, and the fear that he and his family would be trapped. Because London, I'm sure many realize, was bombarded relentlessly by neighboring Germany. I mean, people were sleeping in subways. And one of the things that strikes me about London during my visits in recent years is the virulent anti-German sentiment in Britain, which I think in some ways undergirded Brexit, the British exit from the European Union, insofar as Germany in many ways is dominating the EU. And that anti-Berlin sentiment, a lot of it stems from not only World War II, but World War I as well, where German troops killed many a Britisher. And so he left Britain, returns to the United States, and for a while, he was on the same page as many in this country because he was anti-fascist. There was growing concern in the United States about the rise of fascism. He was a movie star. He was a singer. As I said, he was probably the best-known Black American. He had a stellar athletic career as an All-American football player at Rutgers University, his alma mater. He was also a baseball catcher of some note, played professional football for a while. And indeed, that's how he met Eslanda, his wife, because he suffered an injury and she was working at the hospital where he was hospitalized. And that's how they encountered each other. And so in some ways, Robeson was a combination of Michael Jordan and Denzel Washington, and pick your singer of note, be it John Legend or Little Nas X, Drake, whatever. And so he had a certain kind of notoriety based upon those stellar credentials. And
a lawyer on top of all that.
And, of course, a lawyer on top of all that. And but then things began to change circa 1945, 1946.
And going back to when they left England, do you think this was also informed from them being in the front lines of the Spanish Civil War and knowing that bombings were coming? And if you could talk a little bit about just the amazing work he did at the Spanish Civil War, singing on the front lines, and the Negro Committee to Aid Spain. And
well, yes. I mean, it's very interesting that the Spanish Civil War was taken up by many in this country, and not least Black people, as their struggle. You had the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, which were volunteers from this country who went to fight in Spain. Many died in Spain. One of the few times where you had Black Americans commanding Euro-American troops was in Spain, certainly not in the United States or under the aegis of the U.S. military. And Robeson was in the forefront of that struggle. As he saw it, one had to stop fascism in Spain with the war erupting circa 1936, 1937. Otherwise, the flames of fascism would spread throughout Europe and the world. And of course, he had the gift of prophecy because that proved to be accurate. So he donated his talents to raise money for the combatants in the Spanish Civil War, the Republicans, as they were called, small r. And as I'm sure many know, the Republicans were defeated. The left was defeated, which inaugurated decades of proto-fascist rule under the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco, who was a comrade of Mussolini and of Hitler. Although wisely, he tried to cloak his assistance to them, which allowed him to survive post-1945 before expiring circa 1975, which inaugurated a new era in Spanish politics. Some of your listeners may want to, or readers, may want to look at the book by Richard Wright, the Black American writer, on Spain. He visits there, I believe, in the 1950s and has a very useful dissection of Spain at that particular historical moment. But in any case, Robeson oftentimes said that the way he defined himself politically was as an anti-fascist. Now, this comes up repeatedly because when he's hauled before congressional committees in the 1950s, they try to argue that he is a member of the U.S. Communist Party under an alias, which is something that Robeson denied. I suggest in my book that his interrogators were not sufficiently flexible. What I mean by that is that it was probably more likely, even speaking from the vantage point of 2022, that he was a member of the British Communist Party, more so than the U.S. Communist Party. Although it would not surprise me, and once again, this is how history works, if new information is dug up that suggests that he was, in fact, a member of the U.S. Communist Party under an alias, but saw no reason to share that information with those who would seek to punish him as a result. But once again, Robeson defined himself as an anti-fascist above all.
Oh, thank you. Did any of your research, did you see Paul Robeson have any interactions or writings about anarchists or anarchism? I know he was. You had written about his friendship with Emma Goldman.
Well, I don't recall that, but this is how history works. I mean, someone could probably, if someone would, let me give tips to someone who would like to pursue that course. For example, we know that anarchists were very prominent in 1930 Spain. We know that Robeson was in Spain in the 1930s. So it could be a matter of going through anarchist documents in Spain in the 1930s and see what comes up. We haven't received all the U.S. government documents about Robeson. U.S. government documents can't be misleading, but in other ways they can be helpful to the researcher. One of the reasons we know so much about Martin Luther King is because the FBI was surveilling him relentlessly. And so we have tapes of his conversations, for example. So that may arise with regard to Robeson. But as of today, as I jog my memory, I can't come up with any clear connections between Robeson and anarchists, but I would not rule it out.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and you had written about the detailed, intense surveillance and even assassination attempts on Robeson's life, as well as burglaries they dealt with, and the tampered car. Just, horrific stories in your book.
Well, sure, especially the car. I think he was driving in the late 1940s, or was being driven from St. Louis to Jefferson City, the capital, and some miscreants loosened the lugs on the tire so that the car would go off the road. He barely escaped death. Then there are the concerts in Peekskill, New York, where I know some years ago there was a filmmaker doing a film about it. The film never arose, but somebody really needs to revisit that. And also writing. It was very important. This is August, September 1949, Peekskill, New York, about an hour north of New York City. Concerts where Robeson's performing for the Civil Rights Congress, a benefit. The left is assembled. So are anti-communists and neo-fascists. They begin to give a shellacking to the progressive forces. This is in August, and so then they flee. Progressive forces flee. And then they say, well, we can't let that happen. So they come back in September, and it happens again. And Robeson barely escapes with his life. These are real turning points in U.S. history, because one of the reasons why the United States is so right-wing is that the right-wing organized, and just like they organized to commit genocide against the indigenous population that claimed the land, the right-wing organized to bludgeon the left into submission and to intimidate the left. As a matter of fact, I still find it quite intriguing how today, despite all the blather and bluster about free speech and liberty, how so many people are intimidated by the right wing. Now, you could argue that that's with good reason, because they are willing to shed your blood, but it seems rather incongruous to make that common sense observation that they're willing to shed your blood, and at the same time talk about the United States as this cradle of liberty. I mean, the two do not go together.
Yeah, the hypocrisy is just, baffling.
Yeah, it's, I do interviews for KPFK in Los Angeles, and since it's a bare bones operation, I not only do the interviews, I book the guests too. And it's really shocking to me how so many people are afraid to go on Pacifica even, because because it's associated with the left. I mean, even, you're giving them an opportunity to promote their book or whatever, promote themselves, but I guess they feel it'll compromise their ability to be called by MSNBC or CNN. So this is the country in which we now live.
And the peak scale that you wrote about was just horrific, where the crowd wanted to, quote, scalp Robeson. The police helicopters circled noisily and low over Robeson's head while he was singing, drowning him out. And the hospitals, you write, were, quote, jammed with the injured. The mob was chanting, "We're Hitler's boys, God bless Hitler."
Yeah, it was quite something. I mean, and that was not unusual. That's what's intriguing about Peekskill. It was it reflected the temper of the times.
Yeah, and we're really reminiscent of Charlottesville as well.
Well, that's for sure. Charlottesville, August 2017, when Heather Heyer is killed by, let's just say, a right-wing driver. This is part of this ongoing intimidation of people on the left, which makes people very reluctant to oppose the right wing because they want to survive, understandably.
Thank you. Wondering if you could talk about really Robeson's solidarity with the indigenous. And I know towards the end of his life, he went to Australia and said that he vowed to return, saying you have a serious problem here in Australia. And he also showed solidarity with Guatemala after they were couped.
Well, yeah. I mean, the Australia, I talk about this in my book, The White Pacific, U.S. Imperialism and Black Slavery in the South Seas After the Civil War. The jaunts across the Pacific of many Black Americans and also many Black people from the Caribbean as well. There's probably more from the Caribbean insofar as Jamaica and Australia are all part of the British Commonwealth. But more needs to be said, not only about Robeson's solidarity with the indigenous of Australia and New Zealand as well, but Black America. And then it goes the other way, because one of the top labor leaders in the United States, Harry Bridges, who founded the West Coast Longshore Union, headquartered in San Francisco, led the General Strike of 1934, one of the most important chapters in U.S. labor history, helped to organize the sugar workers and the workers of Hawaii, turning that archipelago from a redoubt of white supremacy into what's the closest thing we have under the U.S. flag to a social democracy. He, of course, was born in Melbourne, Australia, and the United States tried to deport him repeatedly from the 1930s up until the time he died, which, as I recall, was in the 1970s. And he and Robeson, of course, were very close. Robeson and William Patterson, who, of course, was born in San Francisco, were very close. Robeson, it's a person who we all need to know more about. We all need to study his example. We all need to try to emulate Robeson in terms of his industry, in terms of his willingness to study, in terms of his multilingualism, in terms of his anti-fascism, in terms of his forming organizations like the Council on African Affairs, in terms of his struggle for socialism. Robeson still carries lessons for the 21st century.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. Please check out Dr. Horne's work and lectures online. His latest book is The Bittersweet Science. Thank you to Awareness for the music, and thank you for the support.